what is your PDoom from AI?
I think my PDOOM is about as low as it can go without. I think once it tips into the 0%, there's some like certainty or finality to giving that number. So if you say 0%, that means like it is impossible. I don't think it is impossible for AI to cause doom, but I think it is not physically practical for AI to cause doom. So I would generally put myself in the sub 5% category. If doom were to happen by AI within a reasonable time frame, we really have to talk about what timeline we're talking about.
Mhm.
But if we're talking about, say, between now and 2040, I would be shocked if there was a doomsday scenario led by AI.
Okay.
Um,
I think that's a fair thing to specify right at the beginning. I think I'd say 2050 or 2060 or so. But yeah, 2040 it would be like kind of getting into median. This could happen maybe 50-50 for myself. 50 or 60, there's something off with my world model. If we get that far and there hasn't been some like radical coordination thing that's happened, I think we can just set that in the background as timelines, but being very flexible within that. I wouldn't want to like lock in to say it'll be 3 years or 7 years or anything like that.
I should just specify that even though I don't believe in like a doom scenario, I very much believe that there can be major disruption across a global landscape in terms of, especially in terms of economics and unemployment and things like that. So I'm not saying that AI is all positive. The definition of where you draw the line on what kind of doom scenario we're talking about. So a true doom scenario, this doesn't seem likely to me.
I, I kind of think of it as in three categories. There's things like a chaotic misuse, like a terrorist, bad actors, that sort of thing, scammers, all those kind of things, and that blowing up. Then there's a more like ordered misuse of tyrannical governments. And then the third category is dangers from the AI itself. This classic rogue AI paperclip maximizer, but that's not the only form of it. There's a lot of forms that dangers from the AI itself could take, but generally in the form of loss of control. So you're kind of saying that like those first two, maybe those are a concern. What we do about it is complicated, but like this is an issue. But it's that third one that you're saying like, yeah, I don't buy that one.
That's exactly right. I think scenario one and scenario two are practically guaranteed to happen. There's 100%. I'd say there's a 99% chance that someone with a PhD level agent is going to cause something to go wrong somewhere, either intentionally or unintentionally. And then once that capability is unlocked, it is a near certainty that governmental agencies or organizations across the world will piggyback on that capability and use it to their own whims. So those two things are going to happen like definitively as far as I'm concerned. I'd say there's 100% chance of that happening. But from but I would argue that a paperclip maximizer of sorts is is not a realistic. It's a sort of a fictional argument designed to sort of elicit a general understanding of the topic, but is physically impractical to implement.
And I think I wanted to just call that out as being the focus of discussion, but like putting that in a little bit of context, because it can be very easy to kind of fall into a bit of a nerd snipe of, like talking about specific ways that AI could go wrong and whether those are feasible or not. And like what's actually important as just citizens of the world is to think about like the general implications of anything and systemic dangers. That's kind of what informs policy one way or the other. Exactly how things goes down is kind of fun to think about and a good way to engage the mind. But like it's not necessarily something that people need to be divided about. But all that said, let's talk about the specific things. I'd like to hear a little bit more before I argue against it. There's like a lot of different arguments against the reason for like AI being dangerous in itself, because the argument has a couple of parts to it, and each one, someone can object to. Liron Shapira of Doom Debates uses the analogy of the Doom train with a number of different stops. Since you're both familiar with that channel, which stop of the Doom train do you get off?
You might have to remind me of the specific stops for me to
Sure.
pick one specifically, but I can let me give you a little bit of background about how I guess sort of self-identify the risk levels
Mhm.
in general. I don't know if you've seen Liren Spear talk to Lee Cronin on his channel. Lee
Yep.
Cronin is a scientist who is a co-founder or co-author on a paper about assembly theory. I generally consider myself assembly theorist. If I could like summarize assembly theory relevant to doom debate, I would say is that everything in the world, everything in the universe today is an assembly of things. And so doom is a very complicated assembly. We're not currently one Lego piece away from we haven't assembled 99% of Doom. In order to get to the paperclip maximizer, actually harvesting human organs to create paperclips, you have to get to the previous step, which is the paperclip maximizer has to corral humans into a place where their organs have to be harvested. And in order to get to that point, you have to create a place where organs are harvested, and you have to create the train to get the people. Each of these subsequent steps on this so-called doom train, it is possible, it's physically possible to get there. It is such a complicated assembly that the train derails way earlier. As soon as a paperclip maximizer starts
Mhm.
creating places to harvest human organs for paperclips, someone somewhere will create an assembly that takes over before the paperclip maximizer gets its shot to go that route. I think AI is going to become smart, way smarter than human level. I think we're already essentially at PhD level intelligence. I don't think that was a very high bar. I have a PhD. It's not that much harder to be smarter than me. I only have a PhD in one specific topic. And so AI only needs to become smarter in literally two other topics to be smarter than me. Anyway, I think we're
Sure.
already essentially there now. I think capabilities are going to advance forward, no doubt. But where does the train lead to doom? I'm unclear. You know,
This kind of sounds to me like a argument against artificial general intelligence, as it were, existing. That just AI is not going to become capable in the sort of way that if it wanted to destroy humanity, it would be able to.
I'm not against AGI. I in general think we essentially have it now. In my personal point of view, is that ChatGPT in its original release form was already AGI. It was just not agentic AGI, but it was already capable of um, doing things on the G standing for general. ChatGPT I think ticks that mark. I think most people would probably disagree and say, well, if this is AGI, then I'm terribly disappointed. But in my opinion, agentic, ChatGPT plus the ability to like click on buttons on the internet, which is just like a simple, that is AGI. It's already effectively here. If it's not, I think OpenAI probably has access to that level of AGI already today. So I'm not against AGI, but I don't see a capability of AGI causing actual doom. And I think maybe I'll just clarify that for doom, at least in my mind, when I think of doom, I think toll on human life. So we're not talking about unemployment. We're not talking about people being unhappy. We're talking about like ChatGPT or some version thereof, like actually murdering humans in some capacity. And I don't see the physical path to getting there.
I accept that definition of what counts as doom. If, yeah, people are just being unemployed, I would say that more as like a societal misalignment, a kind of people not using it well, which could be very bad, but it's a different category of thing. It's like kind of those three divisions we were talking about at the beginning. I'm going to clarify a little bit about this AGI concept because I think people use it in a lot of slippery different ways. And I think this might try to get at where your objection is because I'm not quite clear on that myself. First of all, I think of G in our artificial general intelligence as being fundamentally a scalar property. It's not something that a system has or doesn't have. If you just look at the word generality, it's something you have more or less of. And so I would argue right now that ChatGPT is very general when compared to, say, a pocket calculator, which does arithmetic considerably better, but only does that, whereas ChatGPT can do quite a few other things, but not as general as people are. Maybe more general in the space of academic pursuits, like ChatGPT can answer questions about a much wider range of academic disciplines than you or me probably can. However, it isn't physically embodied. It can't juggle or cook a latte or play ultimate frisbee. Lots of other things of that nature. Probably a lot of cognitive things that it's not really good at either. It's like so specific like kinds of planning are still sort of challenging to it. Really reasoning and seeing the flaws in its own thinking. There are a lot of limitations there. But going back to the Doom Train analogy, a couple of the classic stops that I see. An early one is that there are certain fundamental capabilities limitations or things that are going to take like 100 years, like a really long time to be able to build. And those are just things that need to be in place for anything else to just be physically possible to happen. And then a little further stop from that is that, well, if that's built, it's going to stay under control. The alignment problem isn't really that hard. None of the people building it want it to destroy the world. They're just not going to build it in a bad way. Kind of like Jan LeCun's argument. We'll just build the good AGIs and we'll build a good AI and not build a bad AI. And then a later stop, another category at the end is maybe there'll be this really powerful AI that comes out and it's like fully general, it can do anything. And maybe it's not totally aligned with human values. Maybe it wants something else, but that's okay because it's not going to overpower us. Humanity will hold its own in any kind of conflict that comes up, or at least find some kind of equilibrium. Maybe we'll trade, or maybe the AI will just rocket off into space and not want to bother with us anymore.
Yeah, we could talk about embodiment just very brief. I guess let me answer your question. So far, I haven't gotten off the train. I see humanoid embodiment of robotics, of ChatGPT style intelligence. That's in the very near future. It seems inevitable to me that once Tesla sells Optimus, I'm buying it. I'm putting it in my house. And that doesn't seem that far away. I think they're saying 2030. They have to build a factory. They have to make it affordable, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to be the first person to buy the very first model that comes off the line. Every home is going to have an embodied GPT. And that GPT will be able to do every task that a human will be able to do. I don't know exactly how long, but Optimus will be able to wash dishes better than me. It'll have sensors for it'll have ultraviolet. It'll be able to get all the germs. It'll fold laundry. It'll fold laundry so fast I won't even see the fold. It'll just clothes will come out of the laundry effectively folded because it's so fast. So that capability is coming, and that's just the train we're on. We're not going to sell an Optimus that isn't as good as the last Optimus. It's just like we don't sell an iPhone that's less good than the previous iPhone with some debate there. So I think capabilities are going to continue to expand, both in intelligence and like physical hardware capability. So then we get like easily into like Jan LeCun territory where he's just like, we'll just have good AGI. I don't necessarily think we'll have good AGI only. I'm not saying there will never be like an Optimus that isn't told to like go do something that is not good. But I don't see it happening in like a global doom version, right? This is really where I get off the train. I suppose I'll kind of ask you this question is, if I gave you today the capability to control every machine on planet Earth, every computer, every 0 and 1 on the internet, how would you destroy planet Earth? And I would, if I can preface this with an answer, I would say nuclear war seems like the best one could manage if they were truly intent on wiping as many humans off the face of the planet, launching every single nuclear bomb in as much damage possible scenario is like the best you can do today. And that wouldn't be, and that would certainly fall into doom category.
Hmm.
But even that would not be enough to like truly doom humanity in the forever forecast of humans 3.0 venturing into the stars type of scenario. We're going to have robots. They're going to be smarter. They're going to be better. They're going to be everywhere, and they're going to be interfaced into everything. There will be more of them than of us, and they will be incredible, and we will not be able to compete with them one on one. And yet, it's just not physically possible for that to cause some version of doom.
Part of the definition of doom is applied by like Yudkowsky and some others is that there's like no humans left at all, not just like a few bands surviving somewhere. And that's kind of important to the argument because when there are some people left, then there's always a chance that we could rebuild and our place in the stars. It would be a really terrible, tragic thing, but not necessarily the end. My question for you right now is, do you think the possibility of a major catastrophe, not necessarily killing 90% of people, but like 10% of people, like a global pandemic that's released on the AI's own initiative, kind of for a malicious intent, doesn't kill everyone, but is like really damaging and is kind of like an attempted attack takeover, but just not succeeding all the way. Is that kind of where your objection is?
It's hard to like put a number on how many people a nuclear launch or global pandemic can take out. So 10%, yeah, it's possible. So we just lived through a pandemic, obviously, and I don't know what the final death toll was globally. I don't know if the numbers from any of the countries that we don't trust are trustworthy. I mean, the answer is generally no, but far less than 10%. We didn't get to anywhere near a billion. And so I think we sort of saw the impact of a very spreadable pandemic. Basically, I mean, I got everyone that I know got COVID,
Sure.
and it did some damage, but generally speaking, we survived. I don't know if we want to talk about pandemics. The problem I have with the doom scenarios is that they're too general. We're sort of saying there's so many ways doom could happen. Maybe it's like a 1% chance of pandemic and a 1% chance of nuclear war and a 1% chance of starvation and a 1% chance of this earthquakes, and so the numbers sort of stack up, but that's not how it's going to go. If there is some sort of doom scenario, it's going to be one particular doom scenario, and that doom scenario's probability is incredibly small. So if you want to talk about pandemic specifically, I would say something like an intentionally released pandemic, virus, bacteria, whatever it is. The likelihood of that doing damage on a global doom scale is very small. We are very good at dealing with pandemics, relatively speaking. We closed down all the doors. China contained every single person in their country for like over a year. We engineered vaccines. We distribute them through global supply chain blockades. We got over it. And so I think there might be some, I mean, I can see a malicious, nefarious user, whether or not it's AI or not, sort of attempting to cause damage. I just think that the human scale of humanity on this planet is, you can't impact it on a doom level with anything that we have today.
So this is basically one of the last stages on the doom train. Humanity is just too robust to be destroyed. Essentially, is the argument.
Yeah, so I suppose
Yeah.
that's where I am. It's not so much that we're so robust, but that in general our systems are are including our intelligence system. So I'm including AI in the scenario, but
Sure.
we can have AI fight other AI. So like one AI releases a pandemic, we've got AIs engineering vaccines, and so our our overall collective survival ability is, I don't think can be disrupted from this starting point today, right?
So
You'd
there's
have
a
to, yeah.
yeah, there's an interesting concept background concept I want to clarify for is one kind of sub debate that's inside of the whole AI debates is the unipolar versus multipolar scenarios. Unipolar is one AI system kind of takes over the world and suppresses anything else from competing with it. And maybe there are subsystems, but they're all in service to the main one in some kind of hierarchy. And the other idea is the multipolar scenario where there's lots of AIs competing with each other, kind of like there are lots of humans and lots of corporations competing with each other today. This whole sense of lots of things competing with each other continues to hold into the artificial intelligence age. And so that dynamic is present. My question for you before moving on to any of my objections to your argument is is that are you assuming the multipolar outcome, and does that feel like a load bearing part of your argument, or is it just something that seems likely?
I'm definitely assuming multipolar for sure. This single like geniac universal computer that is all powerful and all knowing and controls everything and prevents all other AIs from forming again is an incredible assembly of it. Just we're not there, right? It doesn't exist today, and the steps to create such a system are, I don't know if they're untenable to me, but along the way of creating the system, I, we're, it's just, in my opinion, again, I don't know if I have like distinct facts on this, but the universe sort of works out by branching out. So evolution tries everything, right? And tries, not intentionally tries, but basically everything that is possible, we are attempting to create. And I think that for one agent to be able to control all of the possibilities, I don't see it as practical. Is it a load bearing notion? I would say that if I believed that it was possible for there to be a single AGI in control of everything, then talking about pausing AI would make a lot more sense, right? If we were trying to pause train of a single AI, that we are building one universal AI that is in charge of making sure that this happens, I think we could theoretically talk about pause. Like, hey, can we slow down this one thing and not work on it so hard, right? Or control it so it doesn't end up controlling it. But we're clearly living in a multipolar world. ChatGPT wasn't even born into a unipolar world. There was already multiple companies working on similar capabilities, even if they weren't as good at the time. GPT released this new model of Gemini, o1. Within minutes, other companies basically copied this capability of like self-referential and thinking space and things like that. We're definitively multipolar, and I don't necessarily know that it's load bearing in the sense that I couldn't argue against a unipolar model. It just doesn't seem like we're in a unipolar universe.
Summarizing that, you have a pretty strong opinion that AI is going to go in a multipolar direction. And this is relevant towards your sense of like the feasibility of certain governance solutions like pausing AI, for example. But since we're kind of talking about AI doom specifically, I'm not really hearing a very clear sense whether AI doom is more likely in a unipolar versus multipolar world. Is all of that correct?
Yeah, I guess I never really considered a unipolar argument too strongly. I just don't, again, just like general
Okay.
doom, I just don't see it as a necessity to think about, because I don't think that a unipolar AI or unipolar AGI will happen.
Okay, I don't want to get hung up on that question too much since it's a little bit tangential. Although I'm seeing a lot of kind of intuitive parallels between the rationale in your like multipolar versus unipolar argument and then the doom versus not argument as well. So just a couple of like intuition bits I want to throw out there, which might become relevant later in favor of the unipolar argument is one of them is self-reinforcing advantage. For example, if an AI is able to improve itself and gets that ability to improve itself while others are still waiting on humans in the loop, then its rate of improvement increases. And then when you have a larger rate of difference, then that can strengthen the monopoly over time. We live in a multipolar like business world, but it's not like there's only a few massive corporations that control a lot of spaces. There are a lot of specific industries that are dominated by monopolies, and those are very hard to break because of these self-reinforcing loops that they're able to get into.
Yeah, sorry, I guess I can comment on that directly. First of all, if you assume that we're starting where we're starting today, which is in a multipolar world, then an AGI attaining the ability to self-improve itself is a trajectory that all agents are currently already on.
Mhm.
So one agent may be able to improve itself. In fact, I'm almost positive that behind closed doors, everyone who has access to the hard code behind GPTs are using it to self-improve. There's no doubt in my mind that someone at OpenAI has asked ChatGPT to help design some key parameter or help improve some key. I would be shocked and astounded if that wasn't already the case. So we're already on the trajectory of self-improving AGIs, and so the idea of one AGI improving exponentially and leaving the others behind doesn't matter because it just takes the other ones a couple of days to catch up and then they're back on the same trajectory. So McDonald's taking over the world did not stop any other restaurant from being able to follow in that curve. We don't live in a world where there are only McDonald's just because McDonald's was able to like break into the franchise game so successfully. It didn't physically stop other competition.
Yeah. So the other intuition here that I want to bring in that is going to be kind of relevant to both is blurring the distinction a little between unipolar and multipolar. I don't think it's quite accurate to say that we're in a multipolar world full stop. Yes, there isn't just one single power, there's several, but it's not like everyone has equal access to the levers of the world and to be able to control things. There are some people who are in a much better place to have bigger influence and the space to get more still. There is also the question of like, what is a single entity? If you have a group of people who are coordinated with each other, and then they've given some of their freedom to some governing entity, like whether it's a corporation or a board of directors or some other kind of centralized force that they all agree to listen to in order to deal with conflicts between them. Maybe there's some levels of hierarchy there, but it's not total. There gets to be a question of, is that one entity or is that several? I think these things are pretty fuzzy as to which state we're in. I think that will probably apply to AI as well, and that it might be hard to tell whether it's one AI or multiple if they're coordinating with each other, if there's some kind of hierarchy between them. There's also a blurry line in that self-improvement. Like to some extent, all of the AI companies are in a self-reinforcing feedback loop. But then there's this kind of issue of, just in a toy example, if you imagine two numbers and they're both doubling at the same rate, one of them starts at 2 and the other starts at 3. Well, on one iteration, there's a difference of 1. On a second iteration, there's a difference of 2. On another iteration, that difference between them grows and grows and grows, even if they're in the same dynamic starting at the same time, just because of a little bit of initial conditions. I think the thing I really want to point to overall on this, in the case of McDonald's, for example, what's going on in total is that there's some competing forces. There are some degrees of economy of scale. There are some degrees of like market capture that push towards monopoly, but there are other forces that kind of pull away from monopoly of, well, people want choice. So if McDonald's is everywhere, oh, I want something different right now. There might be inefficiencies or bureaucracy in organizations getting too big where they start making dumb choices because they get complacent or whatever else. So the reason we kind of have this weird mix of concentration and decentralized power is because there are forces pulling in both direction. And it's kind of a question of which one dominates and when.
I generally agree. I just to go back to your previous point about, say everything is doubling, right? And so one company has a lead. And so if everything doubles at some point, this company's lead will be so big, even though the next company over is just one day away from doubling to that space. By that time, that this other one will double, and I think that's, mathematically that works, but realistically, nothing is on a perma exponential scale. Nothing I know of is on a perma exponent. There are no exponentials with no bounds in the physical universe that I'm aware of. A virus, a bacteria in a petri dish hits the walls at some point. So there could be exponential scaling. We could get into theoretical. I don't know
Sure.
where intelligence stops. I don't know where, I don't know where the exponential limit of intelligence is, and that's definitely one topic of debate about how much smarter can it get, right? I don't think that one company's initial lead bars another company from catching up indefinitely into the future.
Yeah, and I mean, in order to assess that, and I'm not going to dive into this because I don't think it feels central to this debate. But if I were to press on that, I would start looking into what are their options for anti-competitive practices. Can they capture advertising or block the others from getting resources? Can they lobby the government to get rid of anti-competition laws? And but one thing
Yeah,
that
I,
came
I
up,
think if I could just, I'll just say on that, you could just take the same view on anything that competes with anything at all.
right?
McDonald's can lobby that they get all the potatoes and nobody else gets potatoes and nobody else gets French fries, and it doesn't stop Burger King from existing. They just stops it from serving French fries, right? They'll serve something else. Or Subway comes out, and there's no way to stop everything that everyone is doing on in all, because again, the universe is a sort of a branching sense of possibilities. I don't think there's, you can lobby, and even if you can physically close down all the competition, it just sprouts again as soon as it gets a chance, right? You can kill as many weeds as you can, but one spring over, they come right back, right? And so I don't
Sure.
see I don't see the ability for any one thing to control everything in any real physical sense. I keep coming back. I don't know if you want to circle back to it or not, but I keep coming back to the physicality of Doom. Right?
Hmm.
You have to engineer an actual Doom scenario. There has to be some like actual physical death, whether or not we're living in multipolar or unipolar, whether or not it's the doom is caused by a single AI or multiple AIs. I always come back to, well, how is it killing humans, right?
Sure.
At what point does a human die and say that that death was directly caused by AI and that it is on a global scale? And I can't see it.
All right, there were a number of branches I was going to bring up as kind of building blocks, but I think where you kind of took the conversation, I think I'm going to cut right to the chase, giving a little bit more of a concrete scenario of like just the physicality of how people actually die. And basically, my answer to that is gradually the AI starts converting more and more of our land area into server farms, solar panels, stuff just using more of the physical land and resources to its own needs, its own development. And let's just assume that it's a whole multipolar thing. So there's a bunch of AIs that are competing for this space. And if any of them says, you know what, let's chill out a bit. Like I'd prefer if some of these humans stay alive. I kind of like them actually. Well, it doesn't matter because if it doesn't compete for space, then it's going to get crowded out by the other AIs that are, and it's going to lose the competition. And so yeah, gradually just more and more of our land just gets eaten up in this way. And now that we just don't have the space to grow crops, the air is being poisoned, and so we can't breathe. People need a lot of things to live. We're pretty dependent on the natural ecosystem in quite big ways, even if it doesn't feel like that when we're living in a city. But we really are. There's like quite a lot of life support that humans survive, especially human society. And over time, that life support kind of gradually erodes away. Essentially, basically, we go the same route as the white rhino or just all the various animals that humans have driven into total extinction. Humanity is a mass extinction event. There are many animals for whom our coming onto the scene was the final death null, and they're down to zero and not coming back unless we bring back some kind of gene cloning or something like that. So that's the category of scenario that I would be concerned about in the multipolar world.
Okay, awesome. I guess I'd love to talk about that. First of all, I recognize extinction both in the biological world is very real, and the possibility of extinction for humanity is not out of the question. That's why my p-doom's not zero. So physically, humans no longer procreating is possible. But you said that the bar for life or human life is very high, and I may disagree there. I think the bar for human life is near zero. We have to remember that we lived in caves. We came off of the trees. We survived when there was no, we were, farmers. Before we were farmers, we were hunters and gatherers. There was nothing that we have today, and all that's happened, generally speaking, across the line as more and more and more people came to be. With the exceptions, Black Plague and even COVID, took the little tick down. But in general, even cave-dwelling humans were able to procreate with effectively next to nothing. You touched on two major topics, which was land and air. I can just very briefly touch on those. So land, there's so much land. There's so much land on planet Earth. The vast majority of land on planet Earth is not occupied. It's not even being used. Again, I don't have data. I apologize if with a little bit of preparation, I would have been able to tell you exactly what part of the Sahara Desert actually has Bedouins living in, what part of the Brazilian rainforest is actually utilized for mining. But the vast majority of land, all of Canada is essentially I think 90% of Canadians live within 50 miles of the American border. The vast majority of Canada is unpopulated. So
Mhm.
running out of land, in my opinion, it's not a concern. And then on top of that, we've got water, and I'm not saying live in water, but 70% of planet Earth is still habitable in some sense. And then, of course, we're already talking about going to the stars and space and stuff like that. Whether or not we live in these gigantic structures orbiting space or whether we move to Mars, I think space is not really physical space is not really a concern, especially given our verticality. So that's number one. And then the second thing, and then you said farming. I think on the same scale of on the same topic of land, we've got we're so good at farming now. 90% of humans used to be farmers, and now I don't know what the total is, but it's very, very low. We're very good at farming. We've got indoor farms now, so we don't even need access to sunlight. We can generate artificial sunlight. I don't see humans running out of food being a cataclysmic disaster. And then the last thing you said is air. Global climate change is definitely a concern. I think that you could certainly make that worse. AI could make that worse. Humans are doing a pretty good job at making that worse right now. We don't need any AI to make it worse. But in general, I still don't see the breathability of air on planet Earth as a particular concern. I don't know if we're talking about a particular chemical, or if we're talking about carbon dioxide, or if we're talking about temperatures. We have an incredible ecosphere, right? More carbon dioxide equals more plants, and so there's an equilibrium that's constantly being reached for. We could talk about some sort of runaway greenhouse Venus type of runaway effect, but again, that's another assembly structure that I think we're not on the path to. AI will consume massive amounts of power. That power is not going to come from coal. It's not going to come from natural gas. We're already talking about nuclear. I think there's a lot of stuff these days talking about fusion. A lot of those things are not going to necessarily mess up the air. Humans are going to forever be concerned with the air quality, allowing AI to literally murder the planet while we do nothing. It just doesn't strike me as so far in the sense of AI sort of out competing humans in the physical world. I can't see it as a real concern.
All right, so I want to probe this is to see where exactly it breaks down. So I'm going to leave aside for a moment just completely poisoning the atmosphere and creating a Venus-like environment, and just go with the fairly simple metaphor of there being a machine ecology and a human ecology. this is a gross oversimplification, of course, but like when I talk about a machine ecology, expanding data centers, solar farms, just things that are dedicated towards preserving all the machinery of the world. And maybe people are using it to some extent as well, but it's where this is occupied, people can't live. Now, one thing I'll think I'll just kind of grant also is that humans are pretty resilient in terms of like how much we really need. Living in a first world country, there's a kind of a sense of abundance, particularly economically. And like this house I have, I could live without it. Maybe I'm too accustomed to it. If it just disappeared right now, I'd have a hard time. But if I lived in a different world, I lived in a hunter gatherer society, I could be accommodate to that. Maybe I could accommodate to living in a desert sort of thing. Our actual needs, if we get really humble about it, are smaller than we might think living in the first world. But it's not zero and it's not trivial, I would say either. So I guess my real question though, like kind of just leaving that in the background, if we have this dynamic where we have this part of the world that people can't live in, this machine ecology, and it's growing because the systems that have built it want things and they want more of the things that they want, or there's lots of these things competing with each other. If that grows forever and the world is finite, like the world is big, but it's not infinite. If it keeps growing and the world is finite and that doesn't stop, then we die. So my question is, when does the growth stop?
Yeah, I think you said two things there. First of all, you said if we keep growing, which is a huge if. I don't think we're going to keep growing. I think that we're coming up on a natural population stopping point right now. I mean, I know you've heard Elon talk about replacement rate, and I believe that that's a real. I'm not too concerned with the population declining because I think we have plenty of humans, and I think that we are maintaining our ability to create more humans. So whether or not we have 8 billion people or 7 billion people doesn't really concern me. I don't think that we're going to keep increasing our numbers on a finite planet. So that's a big if that I already stepped off that train, right? My viewpoint is that we're near the apex. We may not be at the top at 2024, but we're going to get to 8.5, maybe 9, maybe 12 billion people. We're not going to 100 billion people on planet Earth. It's not going to happen. And then I think the second thing you said is if we keep doing that, if that does happen, then we die. I disagree with that too. Like, how do we die? So, if we try to cram suddenly, imagine there's 100 billion people
Well, I want to
seeking.
clarify something because we got a little off track. I'm not talking about human population growth leading to everything collapsing and people dying off in an environmentalist sort of way. That is something I am personally concerned about as a progressive liberal environmentalist, but I think that's at best analogous to the thing that I'm talking about. I'm referring more to competing AI systems growing things for their own sake and outcompeting humanity, and that kind of AI system growing and growing and growing. But yeah, if you want to talk about human growth, go ahead, because this is analogous.
No, I guess I think they're interchangeable because we live in a physical world. So whether or not humans grow or whether or not AIs grow, in a physical world, there are finite resources and you cannot grow exponentially. So like AI cannot physically grow exponentially without limit. It will hit a limit. It will need land that it doesn't have. It will need power that it won't have. It will need water to cool itself that it won't have. It will need physical things that's really effectively no different than a human would. Those sets of things that it needs to survive may be different. I think the physicality of our universe will stop a lot of these sort of exponential mindsets that I think spur a lot of the doom debate and corresponding singularity style notions, right? Is that, oh, AI is, as soon as AI unlocks this one thing or one ability, suddenly it gets the ability to like take over. And I just, in a physical sense, I don't see that happening.
So one
Oh, can I
consensus.
just
Go ahead.
I just want to say
Sure.
one super minor thing, because we're talking about server farm. You think you mentioned multiple times this. We need server farms. We need more play. I think so far the models have just gotten smaller. That may not be like a heuristically true statement across the board, but generally speaking, companies are very interested in minimizing their cost. And so things are becoming more compact. Models are becoming smaller and cheaper. They require less power. I mean, I'm from the semiconductor world. We want things to have less, to take up less power, to be smaller, to be cheaper to manufacture. We're not looking to like make bigger, and the way to make a better chip over the 60 years that Moore's law has been around has not to build a bigger, brainier chip, but quite inversely, to build a smaller, cheaper version that uses less power and crams in more smaller transistors. And so I generally don't see AI's need to like take over the world with data farms, because it would be better spending its time on minimizing its need for these gigantic structures than to actually pursue building these gigantic structures.
So I've worked in the semiconductor industry a little bit as a technician, and one thing I can relate to that point about them continuously making the chips smaller and smaller, or compacting more and more transistors into it. But at the same time that those efficiency gains have been happening, Intel's continuing to build more and more fabs, continuing to add more and more space and more machines, to creating all these kind of things. The same thing goes for efficiency in general. In economics, there's this concept of Jevons paradox, where every gain in efficiency leads to more production of energy, not less, because it allows for new industries to come online that previously were not profitable and become profitable because of the gains in efficiency. And so you can see, like, year after year, like since the industrial revolution, amount of energy output per bit of fossil fuels or anything we pull up has been getting better and better, but the amount of energy usage and the amount of reliance on these things keeps going up. And the only times it goes down is like recessions. Now, there was one concession that I want to make that I think is true that you're saying, and I want to spell out, is that yes, when you zoom out, exponentials look like S curves. Things don't stay on exponentials to ever forever. Eventually, it runs into limits, and that's going to cap out, and you get a diminishing return sort of effect. It's like one realm of stability to a new realm of stability. The real question here is, I think, where does that cap out happen in terms of growth? Eventually, the machine ecology would stop growing at some point. But the question is, when it gets to that capped out point where it can't really grow anymore, is this a world that people can live in or not? That goes back to my original question of, when does the growth stop and why?
Yeah, I don't know that I can accurately tell you when the growth will stop. I think there's plenty of room ahead. I think that intelligence is growing. I don't know how much smarter something can be. We have metrics for measuring intelligence in humans, and a lot of that has come down to education and competition. So we're talking about PhD level, a master's level, high school level, and then there's competition. So we say like the math competition, and this is how many this, or there's speed competitions. But if you sort of extrapolate forward and let AI grow as much as it can in whatever domain it can, I'm not sure what a super intelligent GPT is capable of. I guess I just don't have that view. And I think when I've heard, on the in this kind of singularity domain, people say, well, you can't conceive it. It's so
Sure.
smart, you don't even have to think about it. The fact that you can't think about it is in a sense proof that it's going to be so much smarter,
Sure.
because it's going to be so smart, it's going to be outside the bounds of human domain. If you try to think about this like god-like AGI, if you put it in a math competition, it can only solve the math problems. Chess AI can't like reinvent chess. It can only get really good at chess. So I think that AI is going to get incredibly good at whatever it's thrown at.
Mhm.
I don't see it ushering in this era of intelligence that is so fundamentally beyond where we are. And I think that maybe I'll just kind of leave with this point. I know you sort of asked me before where the expansion stops. I'm kind of trying to come back to that point. You were talking about how
Sure.
Intel's opening new fabs. Intel's been growing. In a sense, Intel's had not monopoly status, but it was the leader, and yet it didn't stop AMD from existing. In fact, it funded AMD early in the beginning. Now we've got Samsung and Qualcomm and TSMC. So all of Intel's opening new fabs and constantly re-engineering the future. And look where it's gotten it now. The stock price is a third of what it was 3 years ago. The market's moved on, and opening a new fab. Although I understand that if plot it on a scale, you've got one fab, two fab, three fab, four fabs. But we're talking about a mile circumference factory, not Earth sized factories. I don't see AI attempting to build itself into the physical world in these like gigantic, massive structures. What I think is much more likely is these like multipolar Optimus humanoid robots essentially outnumbering humans. And that level of growth, I think, is a concern. But I don't see this physically displacing human beings being a concern. Sorry, I'm trying to hit on like multiple
Sure,
topics at the same time.
that's fair. One of the points is it was a little bit of a digression, but I think is relevant. That concept of S curves also applies to intelligence itself. Like we can't imagine intelligence as this totally unbounded sort of thing. I mean, one bound is like how much computation do you even need to solve a problem? If you don't benefit from adding any more processing, then like why would you do that? And what would it even be used for, even if you did? I think the kind of two concepts I would say that are important there is one is that in a kind of a nearer term sense, uh, you can't like imagine something vastly and more intelligent than oneself, but you can imagine like a couple of steps ahead. So where I would imagine something considerably more intelligent than people would be an entity that like can think at genius or level on many, many different fields and is also really, really good at coordinating. Like if you had put a dozen of these in a room together, they can come to an agreement and work together, no problems. Any conflicts they come out, if there's a conflict, it's because their needs are genuinely opposed to each other, not because of some weird ego or other kind of stuff going on, or miscommunication specifically. I would use as a better example. That's like just kind of a little intuition. Like I think there's a good reason for there to be headroom above humans. How far that goes is hard to say. And I think that the overall point used in the idea of superintelligence comes to the idea of the optimizer. Essentially, it wants something, it finds a way to get it. Not necessarily because it still has to obey the laws of physics, but in a way, it's kind of reverses the burden of proof and saying, hey, if you're going to say this thing doesn't get what it wants, you should specify a good reason. Hey, this runs into this law of physics rather than just, well, I can't think of a way that it gets there, so that's it. I think finding where that limit is kind of not very important because as long as one admits that there is headroom above people, it might not be able to get anything that it wants. But if its desires conflict with those of people, then too bad for people. And I think that's kind of all that's needed for the Doom argument. It doesn't have to be godlike.
My my argument against that idea is just that maybe it returns back to this multipolar mode, right? So you have a world in which every household has a humanoid robot, and every humanoid robot is super intelligent
Mhm.
and super fast. This is a hypothetical scenario. You can give this super humanoid robot, it doesn't sleep, it doesn't eat, it requires, solar powered, so it doesn't need any energy at all. Effectively, it can coordinate with other humanoid robots autonomously, instantaneously, over the air. Give it whatever godlike abilities you want. Unless you're physically unless these are connected on like a global scale, it's going to argue with my neighbor's humanoid robot, right? Like that humanoid robot is going to want something that, or is going to be told to want something, depending on how you want to phrase it, that is not congruent with what my humanoid robot wants or is told to have. So they can hash out that argument. A lot of arguments don't reach like a natural winner loser point, right? Russia wants to go in Ukraine. Ukraine doesn't want Russia to go in. There's no like, two people can't talk each other out of that
Sure.
scenario. So I don't think two humanoid robots infinitely talking to each other back to back at light speed really accomplishes anything too tragic.
I'll grant that maybe some conflicts are inevitable. I think would it be fair to kind of be in a sort of compromise thing that there is headroom above people in a lot of different domains, but it's not infinite? I think we can both agree on that.
I think I can agree that there's headroom above people. I mean, I certainly there's headroom above my people.
Sure.
Einsteins of the world exist and or existed at some point. I think that there can be Einstein level AGI in every domain. Can it go that much further beyond Einstein? I don't know that Einstein is the end all be all of human capability either. So there's some headroom above Einstein, perhaps, but how much further? On a gut level, I would say essentially, I don't want to say not much further, because a human person can't fold proteins very well. We can create an AGI that can fold every single protein instantly, and that is like millions of miles further than the human person's capability. But the fact that we can fold one protein sort of enabled a million of them to be folded in a second. I'm not sure that this one is better than this one in the intelligence scale. I think there is headroom above humans, but I don't see it causing doom. I don't see a path to doom with super intelligence.
So I don't think this is a crux here. I think like probably where we would put the limit, I think is there's some disagreement here. Like I might put it a little higher than you, but I don't see anything that we've been talking about where like that's hinging on like exactly this particular thing. I think we're kind of in agreement on some of the core things that work in either direction. The big analogy that's kind of on my mind right now, I've kind of brought up humans expanding across the earth and driving a lot of species to extinction. But another analogy that's like a little bit more directly on the nose here is the Europeans showing up in the United States. And starting out, there wasn't really that many of the European colonists. Like we kind of expanded over an area. Their needs were finite. The capabilities difference between the Europeans and Native Americans, like it was significant, but not like it was not like godlike kind of a change. Some advantages in terms of like ability to fight in wars, have high population density, that kind of thing. But those colonies just kept expanding and expanding and expanding. There was some intentionality in that, but a lot of it was just driven by people living there wanted farm space. And then they had children beyond replacement level who grew up and also wanted space to live on their lands. More of it was generally better because then you could be more profitable up to a limit. But then there just kind of kept being more and more of these people. They just kept expanding further and further westward. Eventually, we just kind of got all the way to the West Coast. And the Native Americans that are alive today are either assimilated into Western society or they're in reservations that the government has said, you know what, we want some of this to still exist anymore. And that was a choice. Maybe it was humanitarian driven. Maybe there were other interests at play. That's kind of what comes to mind when I'm imagining this kind of gradual, likely increasing machine scenario that I was talking about is us kind of going in that path. Or worse, if there's like a huge gap in capability, then I would imagine something more like us going the route of various animals that have been driven to extinction. Again, my question is like, that seems like when it's on a trajectory in that direction, I want to expect there to be some coherent reason why that stops. And if I don't hear that, and I don't hear a convincing case why it stops, then that just seems like the default thing of trend lines continue where they're going, follow that out, take where that conclusion goes.
Let's start with where we agree. I agree that there is a doom scenario for humanity that is much further out, right? I don't know how things are going to end for humanity, but if I had to pick one thought, one hypothetical scenario that I think is the most likely, I think some doom scenario where we are slowly edged out of existence is the correct one. The population just slowly declines from 8 billion to 7 to 6 to 5 to 4. Machines slowly take over. They farm for us. This is sort of like a Wall-E style scenario where humans are just like, meh, like, and so the population keeps going down, down. The people who keep getting born into these lives keep living better and better lives. Their medicine is better, their food is better and healthier, but they just don't really have a general need to go out and conquer and repopulate and mass produce. Max Tegmark calls the scenario the descendants scenario. I'm very much aligned with a sort of descendants timeline. I'm putting it at like 700 years, which I think puts me far enough away from any like realistic pause AI doom scenario of 2024. But I think that that's a possibility, right? That AI just slowly, this just sort of slowly becomes AI's planet, that we're just like a phase of biological growth or universal growth that is temporary, and AI sort of takes over because it has no floor below which to sink. I think that's entirely possible. I want to go back to like you said, you haven't heard any good arguments against this, like Europeans displacing Native Americans, and so this sort of seems like it's bound to happen. So I'll give you a couple of counterpoints, I suppose. Europeans taking over North America, South America. There's a very famous book, I forget the author, it's called Guns, Germs, and Steel, which sort of defines everything that was necessary to sort of create this assembly of of circumstances that led to Europeans taking over. But a very clear counterpoint to that is that North American and South American Native Americans did not follow that same trajectory. They've been living in North and South America for a very long time, and they did not conquer all available space. When Columbus showed up, he didn't show up to New York City, right? That was sort of an assembly that only came out of Europe because they were that far ahead on the scale, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think everything tends to conquer and displace. That's not that was like a very expansionist portion of the early to late 16th to 1800. I don't want to, I'm not a historian, but in the last 1,000 years, that sort of like land grabbing feudal government, we were really exploring everything that there was to explore in this domain. So I think there were a lot of circumstances that led to that. I think you could look in virtually every domain and find counterexamples. So, for example, we went to the moon. The number of moon bases has not skyrocketed. We've been to the moon multiple times, and the number of missions to the moons has not gone up. We haven't completely enveloped the moon in anything. We've just generally left it alone. The same thing is true for like Antarctica and things like that. I don't know, look at the military. We created submarines, and the number of submarines, rocket up. But then it S curves back down. We don't make as many now, and the same is true for sail ships and warships, and tanks are about to be phased out. We're going to move into drones, and drones will be phased out. And we'll move into something else. I think that there's like an evolutionary competition that happens across all organisms. I consider AI to be a sort of organism. ChatGPT is one organism and Bard is another separate organism, and they will compete. There will be more adoption of one versus less adoption of the other, and some will go extinct. So some AI models will just not work out, and it's very possible that even the best AI models will suddenly die when a new paradigm is introduced that makes things like I truly think, I think we'll stay with LLMs. If you're just asking me personally, I think LLMs is all you need. So I don't necessarily think a new paradigm is about to emerge and like wipe out LLMs necessarily, but I think that that kind of thing is possible. So I don't generally see one destructive force about to take over that we must like rally against and stop. It's just sort of the natural progression of atoms in the universe.
So the overall point you're making here is that I'm hearing is that like expansionism isn't a given. And actually, I'll add another case that to the list that you brought up. Since I brought up European expansion into the Americas, one could also point to a counterpoint of European attempted expansion into Africa. The Europeans actually tried probably harder to colonize Africa the way they tried to colonize North America, and it just didn't work. Like those attempts just failed, and they ended up colonizing it like economically in a different way by controlling the civilizations, but not through expanding into the population and just having settlers fill the land. Like that didn't happen. But there are like reasons for it. because they ran into diseases that they were less adapted to. I think was probably the biggest one. The disease was on the colonist side in the Americas, and it was working against them in Africa. The thing that I'm kind of pointing to as potentially a little bit more universal is that impulse towards expansion. Not necessarily that everyone has it, but that the ones that don't would get pushed aside by the ones that have, unless they have some other means of defending themselves. Or expansion tries until it hits up against some other expander that's just as strong, or something else, some other kind of barrier. And so the question remains, in the case of AI systems growing and taking up more land and space, like what is that countervailing, counterbalancing force that stops it? Even if you think it's not a given that there isn't one, like that is kind of a question that I feel like demands some explanation. So some AIs are just happy with whatever they have, but others are not. And those are the ones that we care about, because the ones that are happy just don't expand and they're irrelevant. But some of them take a more expansionist sort of course. What stops them?
Yeah, great. I'll try to answer that question as directly as I can. So I think there's two overriding or overarching like anti-expansion forces in the universe. I think one is just our sort of a natural tendency towards equilibrium. So if you look at the food chain, we don't live in a world populated only by sharks, even though sharks are the best at killing. Oh, I don't know if they're the best, maybe killer whales or orcas or something like that, but there's not just lions in the Sahara, right? They live in harmony with their ecosystem. Even that's not to say that 100% of some species go extinct, some species become overpopulated and then suffer an underpopulation, suffer some sort of reversion. There is this natural tendency towards equilibrium because things rely on other things. Even if you're attempting to expand, that expansion is sort of controlled by your ability to expand. If you're killing humans on the way to expanding, and humans are the ones that are building the power plants, then that's difficult, right? So you need to figure out how to build your own power plants before you displace. So I think there's just a general push towards equilibrium in the physical world. It's not perfect equilibrium, but I think that that's one reason why things might not just exponentially go in one direction. And then perhaps to bring it back to assembly theory, I think that one of the ways in which a lot of people don't think about this is that you can be undercut. Even if you are attempting your best, you're McDonald's and you're attempting to put a McDonald's at every, you want a block, every building is a McDonald's. That's your ultimate goal. And you're going out and you're building a McDonald's in every single storefront. You're buying every single what it does is it simply allows more nimble players to come in and undercut you. Be like, oh, you're taking every store? Fine, I'm going to move online. I'm going to go door to door. I'm going to sell at half your price. I'm going to park on your roof and do. There's essentially shorter assemblies that will always be available. So you're trying to maximize your assembly. So one AI might be attempting a total takeover, but it is easier to stop that from happening than for it to succeed. And so I think that smaller, more nimble organisms are able to survive. Again, I think there's some counterexamples to this, right? Humans took over the planet effectively, but we're not the most numerous. There's more ants than humans. I think that one does not necessarily negate the other from existing. So one AI attempting to maximize itself does not necessarily stop other AIs from successfully coexisting, and likewise does not stop humans from coexisting. There has to be some direct animosity in order to facilitate this sort of doom scenario. I think maybe there was some of that animosity back in the Europeans coming over to Native Americans. There was the religiosity. There was a lot of pushes that sort of led to this expansionist method. But at the end of the day, I think that unless you're like actively trying to kill humans, expanding into the intelligence sphere, into the digital sphere, into the capitalistic sphere, none of those things like directly cause human death.
Sure.
So
Actually, you touched on something that I think is a good point of clarification for the Doom argument. Is it generally does not assume malice on the part of the AI systems. Usually, just indifference. That like it wants things, and maybe it cares about humans a little bit, but like it doesn't care about human well-being enough to balance out its concern for other things, and those pursuing those other things kind of leads to humanity being destroyed as a side effect. I've never almost never seen anyone say that AI is going to hate humanity and actively seek out killing us, even if that's against its self-interest in the long term.
well, I don't know that
So
I would
yeah,
agree with that. I mean, I certainly it may be in the like the pause AI sphere. We don't really assume malice. I don't know, but I mean, there's certainly malice in Terminator and Skynet, and there's malice in the Matrix, and there's plenty of malice in other type of scenarios. So
sure.
I definitely think that malice is a factor in consideration for Doom, but I think that Jeffrey Hinton recently talked about sort of AI wanting things. I think it's a question about whether or not AI. I guess it's a question of how you define malice, because in order to, I mean, to do something maliciously implies that you wanted to do that thing even though it was morally bad for humans, I suppose. So it sort of necessitates the computer AI to want something. And I think that we're already, even if you just get there, forget about malice, even if we just talk about the AI wanting something, we're already on shaky ground because we don't know how machines think in terms of wanting or not wanting something. It's sort of an arbitrary scale of where you define what a machine wants or is just, stochastically parenting something else that it was told to do. But ultimately, if an AI pushes the button on a nuclear bomb, it wanted to do that enough that it did it. So I think factoring in malice versus like an intentional desire to kill humans, I guess I don't think it's too relevant. If we're talking about releasing a pandemic that kills humanity, I
Right.
suppose it doesn't really matter if it did that maliciously or accidentally. I don't see either of those scenarios as influential to whether or not it's possible that scenario will happen.
You're talking about limits to expansion. You brought up the example of sharks not consuming everything or becoming the apex predator everywhere. And you also admitted that sort of counterexample of humans. I think what stops most animals from expanding indefinitely is that essentially evolution is kind of playing everywhere. So as predators get better, prey animals also evolve at roughly the same rate so that they keep each other in balance. Even though none of them is trying to be balanced, the system balances anyways. Now, humans kind of broke that because with this reasoning and cognition ability, and specifically culture, allowing it to kind of recursively build on itself, we're able to like, oh, it's too cold, we'll put on clothes. Oh, it's a mother disadvantage, we'll build a tool to help us with that. And are able to be apex predators in Arctic tundra and also rainforests and also in deserts, top of the food chain, everywhere, which is unprecedented. Now, kind of a caveat to that is if you look on the macro scale, humans have just dominated everything in terms of like large mammals and like large animals. But once you get really small, like viruses or even cockroaches, our dominance is really not obvious at all. We don't see the population of bacteria or viruses going down significantly as a result of all the cumulative activity of people, even when we're maliciously like trying to destroy certain very small things. So this brings up a point that there are just certain niches of the world that we just don't really fill very well. It's kind of awkward for us to get there. They're just places we don't expand into. That's where I'm seeing some of the balances. And another balancing point that affects humans is that we rely on the natural environment to some degree. For as many layers of processing we put on things, ultimately our existence relies on the natural world still being around. That equilibrium has a reason, and those are some of the factors that go into it. And I guess the thing I'm wondering about and have pessimistic intuitions come from is where the balance point is for AI and its relationship to humans. Like, we're not tiny little bacteria that exist in these minuscule little niches that are totally irrelevant. Like, where are the niches that we would be able to survive in if, AI keeps growing? Again, you've also questioned that whole premise that AI would be expansionist in the first place. So I think it's a little tricky to talk about because there's kind of a bunch of points of disagreement have come up, and it's hard to focus on more than one thing. I guess the overall question is kind of imagining your vision of like what the future is like. What are the forces that go into equilibrium with AI and humanity, and just where that balance is in your view?
Sure. I'm willing to see the point that humans won't really be able to compete with an embodied AI in the same sense that a lion cannot compete with a tribe of humans. It might be able to take us out one at a time, one on one. It might be able to do some damage, but ultimately it'll be defeated. I'm willing to cede that point that there was an army of humanoid robots that there's no niche that I could survive in and be better at. So robots and AI will be better than humans in all domains everywhere. That's probably a good point of agreement, I think, maybe. But I just don't see this superior humanoid robot's need to replicate itself exponentially for what possible purpose, and in addition to, without reliance on humans in any way, shape, or form. So I think that reliance on humans, I think, will slowly decline over time. I think we're going to integrate AI into everything. We're going to integrate AI into coding. We're going to integrate humanoid robots into the factories. We're going to make power and they're going to be in the power plant. So I think slowly they will gain control and the ability to create more and more this infrastructure to be able to sustain themselves and possibly expand. But I just don't see the need for them to say, okay, just because we can, we're going to maximize all the paper clips, right? We haven't been given the directive to maximize paper clips just because we can, just because we can make paper clips really well. Now we're going to also take over other planets and make more paper clips there. Maybe I'm probably blending two different arguments together. I just don't, just because AI and robots will be better than humans, I don't necessarily see that as a direct consequence or step towards total and utter displacement, or worse, some sort of doom scenario.
I think that's a valid objection. And I also note that it's kind of shifted the objection a little bit more into the question of alignment. This occurred to me when you brought up that Wall-E scenario as being one of the most plausible paths towards human extinction, because that to me sounds like something I would call a relatively aligned AI, something that its interests are compatible with our own. Maybe not totally, because if they were really compatible with human interests, then it might scale back a little bit and try to keep us vital and alive and not just seeping into the easier and easier path and playing into that motivation. So that is a kind of misalignment. But the kind of, I guess, to answering your question in terms of what motivations like could it realistically have that would want it to just expand through the entire world and fill every single niche that it possibly can, accounting for trade-offs, uh, is essentially any goal that's open-ended, anything that can ultimately be reduced to, I want more of whatever. It's not like, oh, I want to create 100 billion trillion paper clips, and in order to reach that goal, I need to destroy this much of the earth. It would be more like, I want to have more paper clips than I have right now. And once I have those,
just make
I'll
more
want more
paper
still.
clips.
Just more. And no specific number, just more of them. And
Yeah.
paper clips, of course, is a silly example, but just like,
No, I'm fine.
yeah.
I'm fine with the example of paper clips, but I think it brings me back to my earlier point. Right? Is I think things in the universe tend toward an equilibrium, As you start making more paper clips and more paper clips and more paper clips, something else says, hey, that dude has too many paper clips. I want some of his paper clips. It's never just a straight arc of paper clips upwards, right? You're occupying a physical domain of paper clips, and now you have new things to consider. You got to store paper clips. You got to make sure they don't degrade. You have to sell some to make some more. So there's just natural physical constraints on atoms in the universe. And then I think just the other part was the short assembly items, which is just, okay, make more paper clips. Okay, I'm on it. I'm making more paper clips. Hey, that guy over there figured out how to make more paper clips faster, or that guy over there figured out how to make something else faster. It's not paper clips, but maybe I could do that. Maybe forget paper clips. Maybe I'll go do that thing. I'll maximize, I'm better at maximizing that thing than this thing. So shorter assembly structures, things that are easier to achieve, arrive faster on planet Earth than things that are harder to achieve. I don't know if you've heard of the Boltzmann brain argument, but this Boltzmann brain argument is just basically like, if you allow an infinite amount of time and everything is possible, then it is entirely possible that atoms could just arrive in space at the exact in time to create a Boltzmann brain, a brain out of nowhere. And realistically, if you extrapolate that argument even further, you say, well, if you have one Boltzmann brain possible in an infinite universe and an infinite amount of time, then there should be Boltzmann brains everywhere. And maybe we're inside a Boltzmann, maybe we're a thought inside a Boltzmann brain right now because we're more likely. And so that's where these arguments sort of break down is Boltzmann brain is one of these incredible assembly you need, in order to assemble a Boltzmann brain, you need individual atoms to arrive at this one particular spot. It's a very difficult thing to create without something like assembling it into existence. And so a paperclip maximizer that just has infinite amount of paper clips, there's a physical barrier towards arriving there. I keep coming back to this point because anytime I talk about every time I see a doom debate, and every time I always hear a lot of people say, well, we just don't know what's going to happen, or if it keeps going exponentially, or if it does this and this. I get off the train at how is it doing any of those things, let alone all of them along the exponential curve? How is it doing any of those things without encountering some real world constraint and needing to branch off the way that everything in the universe tends to branch off?
I think most of the things that come to mind are repeats of stuff I've said already. So I think now would be a good time for a couple of closing statements. I'll say mine and then I'll let you have the last word. So basically, I think the core question that we've kind of been moving around at some point in one form or another is, where is the equilibrium? I think we both agree that there are positive feedback loops and that cause rapid change, negative feedback loops that counterbalance those and lead to a reassessment of a reassertment of stability. The question is, like, when AI and something that can think more powerfully than humans, never mind exactly how much that difference is, but something non-trivial, what is the new equilibrium that emerges, given that we don't really know what its wants or desires are going to be? Like, maybe that, like, there's a lot of question as to where that is. And my intuition is that there's a certain fragility to humans in being able to live in the world. And so a radical shift, and I'm also expecting a very radical change to the point of equilibrium with AI. And I expect humans just to be gone as a result. And your expectation is different, that maybe the shift won't be as big and that humans can survive in a wider range. And so the new equilibrium, we might not like it, but we'll still be around. And maybe we won't be around in a long period of time if there's like in some scenarios, but just the idea of us being destroyed very quickly, that's just not where you see the equilibrium landing. I'll give it to you, and that'll be the last statement of it. And also, I want to say thanks very much for engaging. I kind of feel like we've been listening to each other, and responding back and forth. And like, this is what a debate should be. So I just want to, for whatever disagreements we've had, and also reiterating that we said at the beginning, this is an intellectual subtopic in like much bigger questions about consent and where concern about where the world's going and that sort of thing. So I don't want to get too hung up on disagreements in that for that reason either. All right, go ahead.
No, first of all, I agree. I've had a wonderful time. It's been, I mean, it feels like it's nearly been 2 hours and it flew by. I love talking about this topic in general. I agree. It's been a very fun debate to go back and forth on. I think that in a typical style of a debate, neither side really changes their mind, which is a sort of a tragedy of debate, I think. Probably why people don't engage in it more readily. I think we've covered a lot of topics. I think I recognize your viewpoint, and I think maybe I've articulated mine well enough. I'll summarize just by saying this. I think AGI is already here. I I personally consider ChatGPT already AGI. I think easily within 2025, we're going to get agents and we're going to get some version of superintelligence. I don't know if it'll be the ultimate superintelligence, like the exponential that hits the top of the curve superintelligence, but we're certainly going to exceed, Einstein level capability in the very near future on every domain. So there's the amount of change that the world is about to experience is, I think, unfathomable. And I think the world's not ready for it. And I think that most people are sleeping on this. And then on top of all of that, I think that a little bit further down the line, 5 to 10-ish years, I think that there's a humanoid robot in every house, every household. Some people will resist the same way that some people resisted getting a dishwasher or a washing machine. I like to do my clothes by hand, etc. Like, how dare you? But I think ultimately, no one will no one will cook their own. I can't really think of anything around the household, vacuuming, washing dishes, doing the grocery shopping, cooking. I think no one will be doing any of that soon enough. So I think that that future is coming. A lot of these future scenarios, it's like Jetson future scenarios where you have this maid that runs around, does everything for you. I think that's coming very, very soon. And I think that's a very exciting world to be living in. I'm a techno optimist in the same sense that I'm a general optimist. I just think that humans are incredible. I think that in a small sense, like the paperclip maximizer, everyone that wakes up every single day is just, with barring a few exceptions, every human that wakes up every single day is just looking to not die that day and do a little bit better than they did the day before and make sure that they're okay as they head back to sleep at the end of the day. And so I think that so much can be accomplished with that energy. I just can't see, certainly I can't see like a digital actor disrupting that in a doom scenario sort of way. And then even in an embodied scenario, I just don't see a sort of doom scenario playing out as anything other than this sort of like trip down a hypothetical exponential that never stops, right? And I think that as soon as you come back to the reality of atoms having constraints, they can't create Boltzmann brains out of nowhere. There's a sort of like a probability vector for everything that moves in every direction. As soon as you put all these constraints back on everything, nothing grows exponentially forever. I'm not afraid of being on that curve from a violent doom perspective. I think that there's plenty to fear in the unemployment, capitalism might collapse, malicious actors influencing politics. There's a lot of chaos that will happen, but not doom level chaos.